And let me once again officially welcome everybody to today's webinar, Injecting a Human Rights Approach into Anti-Trafficking Strategies. How can we do better? Today's event is moderated by Jacqueline Bhabha, who is the Jeremiah Smith Jr. Lecturer in Law at Harvard Law School.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this virtual meeting. As was just mentioned, we're going to be spending some time talking about how we can bring human rights to bear more directly on the anti-trafficking work that is being carried out in many parts of the world. And I think this is an important topic because I think it's assumed that everybody who is working on anti-trafficking issues is doing so because they care about human rights. Otherwise, why would you be addressing such a clearly rights-related topic? But I think the subtext of our meeting today is that directly human rights-related strategies and methods have not received as much attention as they should, and that it's important to consider why that might be and to consider reframing the emphasis of international anti-trafficking work. So we have, I think, a good group of panelists today who are going to present some of their ideas to you briefly at the start of this conference. And as you were just told, the idea is that we, in this case, three of us, briefly present our ideas, and while we're presenting, or after we've presented, you send us any questions or comments that you would like to send, and that we address them and do our best to have a lively and informative discussion. So that's really the agenda. I think that it's important to note that the people who are going to be the presenters have different perspectives, and this is, each of us will say what we believe to be the case to the best of our ability, and we're very happy to receive corrections or criticisms from you if you think we've stepped out of line in some way. We don't have any particular target for our overall critique. We don't have anybody specific in mind who we think is doing the wrong thing. We simply want to use this valuable opportunity to air some of the big picture issues that we think are relevant and are important to advancing this area of work which all of us are deeply invested in. So the order of business today is that I'm going to start making a short presentation for about 6 minutes. And I'm going to really be discussing issues related to protection and prevention. And in doing that, I'm going to critique some of the dominant paradigms that govern our thinking about trafficking and determine a lot of the emphasis of anti-trafficking work. And when I finish, then Elizabeth Cafferty will do the same. She'll present for between 5 and 7 minutes on her material. She has a different background, as you'll see, and she has a lot of experience in this area, and will present the work that she's been involved in. And then finally, we will have a third presenter called Dahlstrom, who will also present from her direct experience and will provide information and accounts, which I think will also enrich our discussion. And then that's the first part of this meeting, so to speak, and then it's really over to you, and we're looking forward to having a lively and productive discussion. So I think without further ado, I will go straight into the first few minutes of my presentation, and start off with the title, as I said, for this talk is Injecting Human Rights into Anti-Trafficking Strategies. And the point about this title is really to emphasize the fact that human rights is implied in everything that's done on anti-trafficking, but it's not explicitly in the foreground very often. So I think my first point is really a very general point, which is that the framework that we use to speak, to think, and to act, the framework that governs our thinking really determines how good our work is going to be. And so if we have a faulty framework, then our work is likely to suffer. It's a pretty obvious point. So, think about believing that if you bend 3 times, the clouds are going to weigh and the sun's going to come up. You bend 3 times, nothing happens. Well, you didn't have the right framework. So I think that one of the reasons why so much effort has been put into anti-trafficking work and yet results on the ground are so disappointing is because we are not really functioning with the right framework. And what do I mean by that? So, and this is point number 2, I think a lot of the driving force behind anti-trafficking work today depends on what one might call an anti-slavery model. What does an anti-slavery model imply? It implies at least 2 things. It implies, first of all, that there is a single supply and demand chain. There's an idea that there is a supply of poor, vulnerable, exploited people who can be sucked into this trafficking system. Secondly, it implies that there is a demand for those poor, exploitable victims coming from people who want to exploit them. And in the middle of the supply and the demand are the traffickers who are really providing the service, finding the supply and supplying that supply to the demand. So a second way of looking at this anti-slavery model is to say that it really is, in some senses, based on the notion of a melodrama. You have innocent victims with no fault and no agency who are preyed upon by, and this is the second part of the melodrama, evil exploiters who come in from outside, take advantage of their vulnerability, and then you have altruistic saviors, could be NGOs, could be states, could be law enforcement officers, could be health providers, who come in and save these poor victims from these wicked exploiters. Now, I do not mean to satirize this model because, of course, as anyone who's worked in this area knows, all too often this is a reasonable narrative. Very often there are cases where vulnerable, poor, ill-informed individuals are preyed upon, tricked, coerced, kidnapped by criminal gangs, by criminal and badly intentioned individuals, and the process ends up in extremely exploitative situations which you may call slavery-like, where people are forced to do manual work or sexual work for no reward for hours on end in excruciating conditions. And this situation continues until some outside entity intervenes to stop it. So there is some convincing merit to this image, this model. And as I say in the slide, there are many reasons why the model is convincing. And just to quickly go through the 4 sub-bullets on the slide. So first of all, there's the enormous scale of the abuse and the coercion, the devastating degradation often associated with trafficking. The scale is often a matter of dispute, but I don't think anybody disputes the fact that we're talking about a very pervasive phenomenon. A recent ILO, International Labour Organization, estimate places the figure at about 2.5 million victims worldwide, but who knows if that is accurate. The point really is that we're talking about millions of people who are trapped in these sort of situations. And it's clear, as I already indicated, that people who are trafficked span a spectrum of different situations. We're not just talking about sex trafficking, and nor are we just talking about labor exploitation or indeed organ harvesting or any other subcategory. There's a vast array of different types of behavior which exploiters can use victims of trafficking to perform. And the behavior of the traffickers is extraordinarily well rewarded by the exploiters. And so there is a lot of money to be made in this business. And I believe that Salvador has spoken to you on a previous occasion, for those of you who've already participated. And so you will have heard his calculations about the extraordinary scale of profitability associated with trafficking. Now, because the slavery model has sort of captured public imagination, and because of its compelling quality, it has really dominated public responses to trafficking. And some of the consequences of this domination are, firstly, that the main focus of anti-trafficking work has been to criminalize it and to focus on criminalization. In other words, if you're thinking of the simple melodrama model that I just mentioned, to focus on the evil exploiters, to try and to criminalize the behavior, and then to find the exploiters and to convict and punish them. Secondly, the dominance of this model assumes that having a criminal framework, having a law enforcement model backing the public approach is going to produce deterrence, and that these deterrents will act as incentives for those contemplating this sort of business to stop. So, like with all criminal law, there's an idea that that one of the primary objects of criminal law enforcement, apart from punishment, is deterrence. So you're sending a public message. And so the assumption is that by criminalizing trafficking and by broadcasting this criminalization, you're going to reduce the amount of activity. And because criminalization is one of the key strategies, the international consensus, the international work on trafficking has been carried out within the context of an international, transnational organized crime convention. So the framework in which international law has thought about trafficking has been transnational organized crime. So trafficking fits in this model along with drug trafficking, with weapons smuggling, with money laundering, those sort of activities, cross-border activities, which involve sophisticated networks of people, transporting various sorts of goods or supplies across the world. And finally, one of the consequences of this model is that if you're talking about an innocent victim who's being brutalized by an exploiter, and you are coming in as a sort of savior, what you're really trying to do is to rescue the victim and return him, or more typically her, to where she came from before. So you're trying to intervene to protect someone by rescuing them from their current situation and returning them back home. Now, as I already indicated, the results of this approach, I think, have been very disappointing. I don't think there's actually much dispute about that. So, and here are a couple of quick bullets confirming that. So the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, the Executive Director publicly stated not long ago that the office fears that the problem is getting worse. And it is very clear that only a small proportion of victims of trafficking are actually identified. So if what we're really trying to do is to focus on criminalization, we're not doing a very good job, because we're actually finding only a small proportion of those who are subject to the practice. And even the small number of victims of identification does not lead to a proportionate amount of conviction. So we're not doing very well on identifying victims of trafficking, but even when we identify victims of trafficking, we're doing even worse at convicting the people who have trafficked them. So we have a very low rate of return on what is, in fact, a sizable investment in law enforcement. And so we have some figures here. In 2010, the number of secured convictions of labor traffickers was under 10% of the numbers of identified victims of labor trafficking. So less than 10% of identified victims see their traffickers being convicted. And 40% of the countries surveyed by the UN office I just mentioned in 2009 had recorded no trafficking convictions during the period between 2003 and 2007. So I think that confirms my point that the outcomes of this approach have been disappointing as far as the criminalization and the focus on the exploiters is concerned. As the next slide suggests, the rescue prong of the slavery model hasn't been very successful either. Not only, as I said, is identification seriously deficient, but the annual average of identification is a very small proportion of those trafficked, less than 5%. So this means that a lot of the most important work that needs to be done preventing and setting straight consequences of this practice is not being done because we aren't even identifying the people who are suffering. And finally, the attitude to victim protection itself, which you'd have thought would be uniformly sympathetic and supportive and protective, is actually, I suggest, ambivalent at best. As I've already indicated, the main preferred strategy for dealing with victims is simply to return them to where they come from, and this, surprisingly, is even true in the case of children. So children who've been trafficked often find themselves simply returned to the place from which they were trafficked without any careful scrutiny of whether this is in their best interest, which is what international law would require. And we know very well that re-trafficking is really the order of the day for people who are returned. So very often, if someone is a victim of trafficking and they're returned home, they're likely to be re-trafficked. And that stands to reason. If you think about it, the circumstances which led to the trafficking in the first place haven't changed. So why shouldn't the same dangers apply again? And even international law protection here is quite weak, and I set out why in the slide. So I think this really confirms the point that our attitude to victim protection is not robust. And where protections do exist, such as in the US, they're not adequately used. I think one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of that is the uptake of the US T-visa scheme, which I think we're going to hear more about from another presenter in a minute. But the general statistics here are extremely disappointing. Under current U.S. law, up to 5,000 T-visas can be specifically allocated every year to protect victims of trafficking. And this is a good scheme for people who need protection. So it's something that any victim of trafficking in the U.S. would be happy to receive. And yet in practice, despite the fact that we know that tens of thousands of people are trafficked into the U.S., we find that only a very small amount of T-visas are actually allocated, less than 300 in any given year. So this protection system is not working very well either. It's not only legal protections, medical and other welfare benefits are also disappointing. There's inadequate access to free medical services, and again, you'll hear more about that from my colleague who's going to be speaking to you in a minute. So I think the takeaway from this presentation so far is that there is something wrong with our approach, that the framework we have is not delivering. And I think this is because our model is defective. As I said at the beginning, a bad framework leads to poor results. So how could we think this through better? What other ways are there of thinking about this? So I would suggest that instead of thinking about one supply and demand chain, as I suggest, which I've already described, we think about two. On the one hand, there is a demand from the exploiter, the delivery from the trafficker, and the supply of the victim, as I've already mentioned, right? That's a typical way of looking at trafficking. You have the poor victims and you have the demand by the exploiter. But I think, and this is the part which I think is my slightly more original contribution, which hasn't been thought about enough, there is a second supply and demand chain which we ignore at our peril, and that's a chain where the demand goes from the victims of inequality, exclusion, lack of opportunity, through migration experts who can provide access to better opportunity, who can provide a way of moving from a situation where there are no jobs, where there are no opportunities, to a situation where there may be jobs and there may be opportunities. And so you have demand for movement, you have delivery by the middle people, the traffickers, you can call them, of movement, moving somebody across the border. And the funds that are driving this are supplied by the exploiters at the other end. So you have people who want to move, who take risks often moving, or who are deceived into thinking that moving is a good idea. You have people who are doing the moving and the recruiting, and then you have people paying the traffickers for the recruits because they know they're going to be able to exploit them. So what this means is that if you really want to address trafficking, you can't just focus all your attention, as we've done so far, on the exploiters. You have to focus much more attention on the poor people, the communities that are seeking solutions and that are getting into these sort of difficult situations because they're seeking solutions to their own problems back home. So you need situations where people are moving out of situations of lack of opportunity and lack of employment into situations where there's more opportunity. So what would a more effective human rights strategy look like? I would suggest it would include the following elements: that the T visas which exist in the U.S. would be allocated much more generously, and would at least the quota of 5,000, which is nowhere near enough, would at least be allocated in full every year, and that would be an obligation for the people working in that department. That would be doing their job well, but would be not to issue as few visas as possible, but to issue as many T visas as possible. Secondly, there should be much better identification of victims. So much more effort should be going on to identifying people who are at risk, identifying people who are in difficult situations, focusing less on the traffickers and more on people who may be in need, who may come forward in health clinics or hospitals or be on the streets or in other situations. There needs to be more aggressive monitoring and evaluation of the expenditure on the services that trafficked people have a right to make sure that the gap between the theory that they have access and the practice is narrowed. In other words, to make sure that they do get access to these services. And there finally needs to be more evaluation and more effort placed into freeing people who are trafficked from the clutches of their traffickers, for example, by providing them alternative employment, providing them a more secure immigration status, rather than simply thinking of returning them back home automatically. So in short, I think we need to think much more about the root causes of trafficking. We need to inject funds in a much more focused and aggressive way into projects which target communities which we know produce victims of trafficking, and we need to monitor the results of that in a much more aggressive way. So those are some of the comments that I thought I would just offer to get us going. And now I think what we will do straight away is we'll go into the next presentation, and my colleague Elizabeth Cafferty is going to follow me and give her remarks.
Thanks, Jackie. That was actually a great introduction, I think, to what I'm going to say. And so I've been part of a study that took place, it was over a year. We spent going to 8 different cities, which are considered hotspots for sex trafficking in those 8 cities in 5 different countries. And we were looking at sex trafficking of women and girls from a public health and human rights perspective. And so what does that exactly mean, and why would a hospital be interested in doing this? And I think for a lot of the reasons that Jackie touched on, that Massachusetts General Hospital was interested in how it could become part of anti-trafficking efforts. So what more could be done for victims of trafficking other than really sort of patching them up when and if they present it? So our research questions were, how can a public health lens characterize the underlying conditions that permit and foster sex trafficking of women and girls? how can local public health systems directly intervene in order to assist sex-trafficked women and girls? And how can health systems contribute to multi-sectoral strategies for ending sex trafficking of women and girls? So we did our research in India, in Mumbai and Kolkata, the Philippines, Manila. We also went to the UK, in London. In the U.S., we did research in Los Angeles and New York, and in Brazil, we did research in Rio de Janeiro and Salvador. And we certainly found in terms of health outcomes that, I could take up an entire presentation talking about the poor health outcomes that are the result of being sex trafficked. And that's everything from the sort of obvious things, the first things that people think of, which tend to be STDs and HIV. There's women and girls are physically abused. They suffer from anxiety, depression, PTSD, suicidality. Dental issues is actually also a huge problem for this group. Malnutrition, really anything and sort of you can think of in terms of poor health outcomes. But what of sort of at least as much interest and more interest to us is what are public health systems doing at the moment to fight sex trafficking, if anything, in these areas where it seems to be most prevalent. And so as you've heard, we looked at developed countries, developing countries, emerging economies, and so we're able to compare how resources were allocated, what the awareness was in different regions. And also we looked at cities that had more robust public health infrastructure. So obviously in London you have the National Health Service, and that is going to provide a completely different set of services and access points than you would have in, say, Los Angeles, which, while in the United States has a very robust public health system, would be completely different than London. What we found across the board, though, was that it's very difficult for victims to access the right to health care. So although there are numerous international agreements and treaties that reference the right to health care, in practice, these rights vary significantly country to country and city to city. And actually accessing them, even when they exist, is very confusing to most victims or to service providers who are trying to work with survivors of trafficking. And everywhere we went, we heard that the services, even when they were easier to access, they were insufficient for the needs of victims. And so what are some of the barriers? There's many different types of barriers to accessing health care. So if you're still in a trafficking scenario, the traffickers usually act as a barrier. When you're still in this scenario, or even after you've escaped or left, however you've exited, many victims who are not from that country, so if you've been trafficked internationally, they fear being deported. And this is the case even in countries such as this one where we have the T-visa system, but that's because if you are a victim, you're less likely to be aware of that option. And you normally will have been told by your trafficker, there's no reason or you would not want to go to the authorities anyway because you'll simply be deported. So there is a definite fear, a very real fear of that. There's also a lack of trust in service providers and a fear of discrimination. So this group also, when presented, is not seen by a healthcare provider or identified as a victim, as many wouldn't be if they don't disclose, which they virtually never would walk into a clinic or emergency facility and say, hi, I'm a victim of sex trafficking. They would be seen usually sometimes as a prostitute, sometimes as simply a poor woman. And in some of the countries that we went to, if you're accessing public health services in the first place, it means you are poor, are from an ethnic minority. And so we found some institutionalized racism, sexism, discrimination in the healthcare services. And even when there were lower levels of it, women had a fear of it, and so assumed that they would be treated poorly by healthcare workers. And so this real sense of discrimination, stigma, which acts as a barrier. Lack of understanding of the entry points and entitlements, and that can even be for women and young girls who are citizens of the country in which they've been trafficked, just not knowing how to negotiate the healthcare system. And lots of service providers, too, had questions about what if someone was found to be a victim, or sometimes girls might be identified not necessarily right off the bat as a victim of trafficking, but maybe as an asylum seeker or a troubled young person, and there was a lack of clarity with service providers as to what exactly these women and girls were entitled to. And then really basic things that, marginalized and hidden populations in general struggle with. Geography, how far away are you from the nearest sexual health clinic, emergency room, healthcare worker of any kind, and what are the clinic hours? Are you even able to access them? Language barriers, if you don't speak the native language in that country and you go to an emergency room or you go to a healthcare clinic, how are you going to speak to this person? And in terms of healthcare workers, how did they respond? Whether they were, there was a patient who presented and they started getting sort of bad vibes and wondering what was going on, or whether they were actually brought someone who they were being told, and this is the case often in India, physicians would be told by a local NGO, this girl is a victim of sex trafficking, and we're bringing her here to do a sort of first checkup. How healthcare workers responded really had to do with their awareness of the problem and informal relationships that they had built with service providers. So again, in India, there were more links between service providers and healthcare workers, which helped many girls have better experiences, but very often that was not the case elsewhere. And those who had low awareness were less likely to be, unsurprisingly, be as helpful as they could be to victims. So basically, we saw this as a real opportunity for health to take a greater role and to work across the community with groups already involved in trafficking. Healthcare workers can't come into this arena and solve this problem on their own, but building on other people's learning and bringing their unique skills and experiences, we think that there are really lots of opportunities for them to help contribute to anti-trafficking work on prevention, the prevention end, identification of victims end, and also to provide women and girls with better rehabilitation services. So number one thing that really needs to be done everywhere is raise awareness amongst healthcare workers, trainings at clinics, sexual health clinics, rural clinics, hospitals, emergency rooms, and also health professional schools. So getting at new physicians, nurses, other healthcare workers, and also somehow getting involved in ongoing, continual professional development and education. As I just mentioned, identify victims in healthcare settings. So similar to how victims of domestic violence, there's now a regular screening protocol in the United States and in the UK, looking at women and asking certain questions to determine could this woman be a victim of domestic violence, broaden that out to consider sex trafficking. And if you raise awareness, we also need to provide better care. So once healthcare workers have a better sense of what the needs of this group are, they'll be able to provide more tailored and more comprehensive holistic care. Jackie mentioned the sort of mental health care. This is probably the biggest gap in healthcare services for victims. There's a huge lack of there's a lack of mental health care workers in most countries around the world, and certainly this group's access to them is incredibly restricted. And there's also the opportunity to use knowledge of prevention. Who is at risk? Who's at high risk for this? So then to go out into source areas to try and help prevent trafficking. how can healthcare workers work with people who are already in this sphere? What I just was mentioning, prevention efforts. So there are local organizations, NGOs, and other groups who are active in source areas, so putting together protocols for, who's at high risk and how can you prevent them from being trafficked. And also, again, what Jackie mentioned before, this idea of returning people to where they came from can be very dangerous. And so how do we lower the risk for people, and we don't want them to be re-trafficked. Work with people who are already advocates for underserved populations who often have a better idea of how to access social services for these groups. So domestic violence, child abuse, HIV communities, they've already sort of beaten paths in these areas. How do we get better access and better services for these groups? And working together with those communities will be helpful. And also use this information to not just work on the ground, but try and speak to policymakers and inform local and national anti-trafficking policies. So again, clear that things aren't working the way they are, but how do we make them better? And then I just gave a couple of more concrete examples based on areas that we went to. So in India, there are lots of community groups and government agencies who have very strong anti-HIV programs right now. So try to incorporate some awareness about trafficking into those efforts, because they're already reaching out to the groups who are at high risk for trafficking. So children who are not in school, families who are in rural areas with very low income. So they've already got a sort of captive audience, so to speak. So how do we become part of those conversations? In Brazil, where we found lots of institutionalized violence in the healthcare system in terms of treatment of poor women, incorporate training on violence against women into health professional schools. So for people who are being trained and for people who are already working, and also more efforts there on how can you gateway for other services, so better referral methods onto other social services, which in fact the UK is a really good example of how that can work quite well. In the US, sort of just recapping, built on this very strong DV, domestic violence, anti-domestic violence and sexual violence work that's been going on now, and the knowledge of that group and the protocols that they've got in place. So have that sort of as an entry point to say to healthcare workers, this isn't something so different or something that you can't, get your head around and work against. You're probably already doing things with those groups that would be very helpful to apply in situations of trafficking.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That was a terrific overview, and I think raises many, many questions about how we really can move into a more rights-based approach which targets the needs of people who've been in situations of trafficking, and it shows a lot of a lacuna in what we do at the moment. So our last presenter is Julie Dahlstrom, and Julie, I invite you to make your comments now, please.
Thank you very much, Jackie. So I was asked to address some of the practical obstacles encountered in doing this work, and really what I hope to do is kind of follow up on Jackie's presentation to talk about what happens when you overlay this imperfect legal framework over very, very complicated cases, and really what are the implications in terms of immigration status, the ability of survivors to remain safe, and really the ability for us as advocates to effectively combat trafficking. So just as a preface, I come at this work as an immigration attorney, and I'm speaking in my experience in terms of representing survivors to obtain T visas. So this is somewhat of a U.S. perspective. And what we do is liaison with law enforcement, try to help survivors obtain continued presence, which is a temporary form of relief for survivors here before they would get the T visa, and then pursue other forms of relief. So what I'm going to talk about, I'd like to arrange my talk kind of chronologically. So when advocates see these cases going from identification to really, T visa, or, what we view as might be the end of a case, and then beyond that, and what are some of the obstacles that come up when we're dealing with this legal framework, in terms of the beginning, this is echoing some of the issues brought up by Jackie in terms of the identification of survivors, the struggles that we find when we're effectively trying to fit these survivors within a definition that isn't perfect. The gray area in terms of the investigation and prosecution process, and when you're working with different investigators, with law enforcement from different agencies, how do you as an advocate, as an attorney, or as a social worker really help survivor navigate the process, and what are some of the difficulties in doing that? And then the beyond. So basically, if you have a, quote, successful outcome in terms of getting a T visa, but the client, in essence, is not safe, that there are ongoing challenges in terms of their own protection, in part because of the issues Jackie raised in terms of addressing long-standing inequities and issues of poverty in their own country, what do you do as an advocate? So I want to start with the beginning, and these are a couple of the issues that I see as large problems and really as obstacles for clients to get these T visas that Jackie mentioned. I find one of the most difficult issues is that the cases that come to me are very complicated. Survivors don't fall into clearly, clear categories. You may have a survivor who has a history of domestic violence, who is a victim of violent crime, and is a victim of trafficking as well. And how do you encounter that person in the story, and how do you unravel it when it may take 6 months, a year to really understand what is going on in the case? In terms of the overlapping legal framework, so in the United States there are a variety of forms of relief. There is this T visa. There are other forms of relief like asylum that helps people fearing persecution. So you might be presented with a case that falls somewhat within each of these categories, but because of the problems in terms of the categories, they may not fall exactly within the categories. So for example, with a T visa, you have to prove that the person not only was a victim of trafficking, but they also, in general, this is a requirement, although there are exceptions, they also responded to a reasonable request from law enforcement. So you can imagine, for example, I had a case where a client really was a survivor, but was very fearful of federal law enforcement because of cultural norms in her country surrounding the police. And in that situation, even though they are a survivor, they may have difficulties fitting within that framework. In addition, I'm seeing more, and I think just nationally people are seeing more mixed-sex labor trafficking cases. So again, these cases don't come in boxes. I can give you an example of a woman who was brought to this country and sold to a man as a second wife, and then forced to pay off a debt when she refused to marry him. And it took very long for this case even to get to me or to get identified at all, because people saw this, one, as I think a sexual assault case and didn't see it as a trafficking case. And then once we identified it as a trafficking case, it was very difficult because it was both sex and labor trafficking in terms of knowing what law enforcement agency to go to and them knowing how to address the case with certain jurisdictional issues. So that's become an issue with these cases. In addition, in the United States, in order to prove that someone is a victim of trafficking, you have to establish force, fraud, or coercion. And often that's very difficult to prove and may take into account cultural norms. For example, I heard a U.S. attorney give us a story of these women that were involved in sex trafficking who were never overtly threatened, but the traffickers would use this traditional ceremony where they, quote, held their souls until they completed their work. And the question was, he argued that this was coercion, but that without the backdrop of understanding the culture, it was very difficult, I think, initially for prosecutors to conceive of this case as a trafficking case. The fourth issue I'll just mention briefly is this idea of victimhood versus criminality. And this goes back to some of what Jackie mentioned about the melodrama model, the idea that we want to see these cases in terms of black and white, and also the idea that we have a system in the United States that criminalizes prostitution, yet defines a trafficking victim as something involving force, fraud, or coercion. So it creates this kind of binary system which creates real barriers to cooperation and to working with survivors. I've worked with folks who have really fled after being accused of crimes when they really were a survivor, and they never sought any kind of protection, and no one was there because they identified them incorrectly, and that's a continuing problem. So I want to just, in terms of those issues, go quickly through this example, and I think it highlights some of the problems surrounding identification that tend to come up. The names have been changed, so struggle with me through this somewhat long example. So Jean was a survivor from Vietnam who fled the country to escape an abusive husband. So this is common. I mean, the involvement of domestic violence in these cases. She was smuggled into the United States, and once in the U.S. was a victim, again, of repeated sexual assault at the hands of her employer. Now, when she finally left this job, she sought work as a masseuse, but then was forced violently to perform sex for money and eventually fled. Now, imagine that later she was actually approached and asked to perform sex for money, never threatened or physically abused, but told, you know, quote, you know what will happen if you don't do what you're told. And she's later arrested and charged with prostitution. So I know this sounds like a dramatic example, but this is very similar to cases that come in that are very complicated and difficult to unravel. So, you know, you see the issue in terms of this person could potentially be eligible for asylum. Maybe they can't go back to their country based on the abuse, but maybe there are difficulties in terms of proving that, or, you know, deadlines that they didn't actually fulfill because of that. So the question is this an asylum case or is it not? And how do you really frame or think of the case? Is this person a victim or a criminal? Now, I think everyone on this call would be able to think through that, but I think that you really do encounter those issues in terms of approaching law enforcement or prosecutors. In this particular case, which is very similar to a case I've had, it's very hard, you know, in this last scenario, how do you establish coercion? That you both need a framework for the prosecutor or law enforcement to really understand how that last piece could be coercion, because in and of itself it might not be, although it might arguably be, but you have to look at the underlying facts of the whole story and how it does take time to really do those things. Okay. So beyond identification, I want to talk a little bit about the gray area. So that would be basically investigation and prosecution of these crimes. What are some of the issues that come up when we're bringing cases to law enforcement or to prosecutors and having difficulty arguing that this is indeed a trafficking survivor? I think one of the largest issues is that for attorneys, at least, this isn't usually what we do. You know, we are used to creating this or participating in this adversarial relationship, and I think when working with law enforcement, often that is recreated. And on the law enforcement side, I've heard from investigators, basically, you know, usually they don't work with witnesses who have attorneys or who have other advocates. And so it is this kind of amorphous process, and everyone is struggling to know how to interact with each other. And I think there's this tendency to really recreate this adversarial model that isn't productive for the survivors at all. What I argue with law enforcement is we should really look at overlapping areas of common interest, because in essence we are both trying to forward, to progress, you know, to work for the survivor. So the other issue that comes up is the lack of leverage of the survivor in the process, and this is in part because of problems within the legal framework. So, but what in essence happens is that in this negotiation setting, basically when we're meeting with law enforcement, usually it's nice when there's leverage on both sides, and we create a process that would empower people. But I think what is unfortunate is that often advocates are asking for law enforcement to certify the person as a trafficking victim, and the survivor may not have a lot of leverage in that process. They can either cooperate and hope to be certified, or they can not cooperate and perhaps not have any chance at relief unless, again, they fall within a small exception. So it actually recreates this dynamic that was present in the victimization, where there is this imbalance of power and can be, again, re-victimizing to survivors. The other issue I'd like to just briefly mention, which goes along with the lack of leverage, is just because in the United States the system with T visas and the requirement, or generally you would need to submit a certification from law enforcement, is that there is no review of the denial of a certification. So in essence, law enforcement have the ability to say no, and the survivor is kind of left. They can still apply without that, but it is much more difficult. So it becomes difficult as an advocate to really continue to zealously, advocate for your client. And then the failure of existing legal mechanisms. So there are some mechanisms within the U.S. legal system that help survivors, for example, get status while they're waiting for the T visa, which is continued presence, but they aren't working effectively. And I won't go into the details here, but I just want to echo Jackie's concerns that we have a system that is somewhat flawed. And so, yes, it doesn't play out in the real world the way it should. So we may be needing to look at that original system. And then the great beyond. So basically, let's imagine that we are able to get the T visa for the client. Then what? And I think the problems have been that traditional case management or legal services have an endpoint. The person gets the visa. But these cases are increasingly more complicated, and traditional models don't really work. That is in part because the nature of trafficking requires long-term solutions. So, for example, there may be threats that the individual is receiving, the survivor is receiving after the T visa is obtained. There may be issues of poverty or abuse of women that are affecting their families back home. And how do we address those issues once the visa is issued? And then limits of funding and capacity. This is just a large issue, I think, that all social service providers or NGOs face. We're funded for very limited reasons, and if we provide those services beyond the T visa, then maybe it means that other folks can't receive those services. But I think we have to look at these cases and potentially funding in the future as taking a very long commitment, because that's the nature of what trafficking is. And then the lack of effective international systems to respond to continuing threats. So, for example, the person is receiving threats or against their family in their home country. What can we effectively do to help? We may not have an international system that can reasonably protect them, and yet we have a system where they're encouraged to give information that could put them potentially at risk. So that's a continuing problem. And as I addressed before, just the failure of traditional social service models. So I think while the domestic violence structure is helpful for us to build on in terms of doing trafficking work, there are certain limitations to that as well, because this is a very distinct population. So we really do need to come up with a model that works better for these individuals. So I'm going to offer one more example that kind of highlights those issues. So Josefina is a labor trafficking survivor from El Salvador. She received her T visa and is in the process of applying for her siblings to come to the U.S. So she's applied for her derivatives. During the process, her trafficker approached her family members in El Salvador, asking them to pay her debt and threatening to kill them if they don't pay up. And then at the same time, Josefina discovers that her sister, who she is petitioning for, is being abused by family members in her hometown. She becomes distraught because she feels powerless to protect her. And in the real world, things like this do happen at the same time, amazingly enough. So it raises the question, what is the advocate's role? How involved can you become? And how do we overcome these real long-term barriers? How do I advise my client about debt? Of course, I say you don't have to pay this debt, but it is very real and really does affect her family security. And then what do we do when there are no international structures to solve these problems? And this goes back to Jackie's critique. There's such an interconnection between trafficking here and issues of poverty or violence against women, and if we aren't addressing those issues, then people will be re-trafficked, and we will continue to see these issues even after the T visa, et cetera. So keys to success, these are a couple of things that I feel have been helpful for me in working within this structure that isn't perfect. In terms of taking time to really understand the survivor story, because it often is much more complicated than you could ever imagine. Trying to establish trust with law enforcement as possible, and obviously there are limits to that, but I've found that, only when we really dialogue are we going to be able to have a conversation about what we can do to work with survivors and to really help them. And talk with other experts like this call. You know, I think these cases are multidisciplinary. They need a multidisciplinary response, so we need to be willing to talk to people as issues come up. And I'll just go to the last, which is developing new approaches to trafficking work to try to address, you know, some of the issues and barriers that we're talking about, in addition to potentially looking at the legal framework, as Jackie mentioned, and build an approach that really works and is more victim-centered. I think that's it. I'll throw it back to Jackie.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much. Well, I hope you'll agree that we've had two really wonderful presentations, very concrete and very specific, and I think altogether the picture that we paint is pretty coherent, that there's a lot that can be done very specifically and concretely to improve the protections for people who find themselves into these situations. So now it's your turn, and we have our first question. Somebody called Emily, and the question is, do you feel that not enough attention and focus is being given to human trafficking of minors domestically in the United States? So let me just start off by saying I think it's a very good question, because we certainly do not mean to create the impression that trafficking always is across borders, because you can be a victim of trafficking within 10 minutes of your house. And so there is a lot of human trafficking within countries. And as the question suggests, there's also a considerable amount of trafficking of minors. So the question is, do we feel that not enough attention and focus is being given to domestically trafficked children in the U.S.? So I don't know if one of my co-panelists would like to take a stab at this. Maybe should we start and see, Judy, have you dealt with any cases like this?
So we deal mostly with international rather than domestic cases, but what I urge people to think of is really thinking of these cases, domestic and international, as a part of, you know, some of the same trends that are happening. But I do think, you know, I think we need to pay more attention to domestic and international minor trafficking. I'm not sure that is responsive to your question, but it may be that Elizabeth deals more with the domestic minors.
Yeah, I think Elizabeth would certainly have something to say, right?
So I don't know if I'm going to say there's not enough attention being given, but I would say that sort of different attention and different strategies need to be incorporated, one looking at children's needs versus the needs of adults. Interestingly, and we found in sort of a number of instances that in London and in the UK there was some good practice in terms of services. And the sort of children's protective services over there are able to offer much more sort of comprehensive support for children than adults. And one big issue that they have there is, you know, what happens when you turn 18 years old, because there's still a need for support in that sort of transitional period. And so they're working on how to bridge that gap. And so I think that there's some learning that can be done in the U.S. looking at the UK model. But I think sometimes not enough attention is provided to the different needs of children is what I would say.
Yes, I think there's a very good observations. The last point I would make is that I think that we know for a fact that in some parts of the U.S., like in L.A., there are very sizable numbers of children who are trafficked. And I think many of the problems that arise are not just that the services are inadequate, but actually the problem you already mentioned, which is the problem of identification. And if I remember rightly, Elizabeth, I think in your report, there are some examples of cases where you did interviews with doctors who, while you were interviewing them, said, oh yes, I remember this young girl was brought in by somebody, and now when I think back, I think that must have been a case of trafficking. But I'm sorry to say that in retrospect, this is striking me now, but at the time I actually didn't really realize it. So I think, you know, when children are brought in, for example, if there are girls who are being sex trafficked, and they're brought in because they have some physical ailment, it might be difficult to spot that this is a trafficking case. And so that's, I think, where Elizabeth's Elizabeth's point that training of health professionals is so crucial comes in, because really there are contact points which we're missing. And so I think the question is very well framed, that we do need to focus, we do need to make people who are in the sort of front line of meeting people who've been trafficked, we need to make them attentive. Okay, we have another question from Karen. Do you have a position on the international marriage brokerage industry as it relates to sex trafficking? So I think, again, this question raises an interesting point which we didn't address directly, which is that very often there's a very thin line between forms of transnational marriage agreement and situations which can become quickly abusive and exploitative. I think that, maybe I'll start off just by making one or two comments and then invite my colleagues to jump in. I think it's, first of all, very important to distinguish marriage brokerage or forced marriage from arranged marriage. There's nothing wrong with arranged marriages, in my view. Many cultures have arranged marriages as part of their custom. And there are many situations in which parents or family members suggest a marriage partner to one party, and then the marriage takes place. And these marriages may be as good or bad as marriages which are not arranged. There's a big difference between that and forced marriage, or indeed some of these marriage brokering situations where people are kind of deceived into agreeing to situations which then end up being exploitative. And I think that one of the real difficulties in this question is how you protect people who are in positions of vulnerability. So, of course, one doesn't want to restrict people's choices. You don't want to say to people, you cannot agree to marry someone you haven't met. At the same time, one has to be cognizant of the fact that in many situations, migration, as I already suggested, seems like the only way out, and marriage may be the only way to migrate, and so the danger is really there. So my answer would be that I think that marriage brokerage is something one has to look at with a considerable amount of attention, and that forced marriage clearly is illegal and should continue to be illegal. Forced marriage can often rapidly deteriorate into situations of abuse and trafficking, but arranged marriages can be perfectly acceptable, and so one has to make fairly subtle discriminations.
We didn't run into sort of forced marriage as a problem so much as what some people call the boyfriend scenario or lover boy, and that sort of dating relationship, that's putting air quotes around dating, where girls would be sort of lured into sex trafficking by a much older man who they began a sexual relationship with and who they thought they were in an exclusive relationship with, and then suddenly they find themselves coerced into sleeping with this man's friends, acquaintances, other men for money. And so a sort of like slippery slope, if you will. That was the sort of entry point. These women didn't think that they were engaging even in prostitution in the beginning, but they thought they were starting a relationship. So that's more often what we encountered rather than forced marriage or marriage brokerage.
Julie, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure. I would just, echo Jackie's thoughts. I think as a legal program, we do both domestic violence and trafficking work, and so we do see quite a few cases that involve forced marriage and arranged marriage. And the only thing I would add is that I do think it is very important in terms of the identification of survivors that we really look carefully at those situations. And as you said, some of them may not necessarily involve abuse, but some really may. But you may have to dig. And in the trafficking situations, we've had very complicated trafficking situations where you may have to know quite a lot and really have a lot of trust from the survivor in order to understand the situation enough to make an identification.
she initially agreed.
Right. Sorry, at the beginning. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Sorry, I think we had a technical flaw there, so please forgive me. I'm going to repeat the question, and if you've already heard this, you can just do something else for a few minutes. But I'm responding to the question from Anna, which was, do you believe trafficking and slavery should be used interchangeably, and if not, what are the differences? So my answer to that is that I do not think that they should be used interchangeably, and I think that there are differences. The first and most significant difference is that trafficking includes situations in which people have agreed initially to participate in a contractual relationship, whereas slavery never does. A slave never agrees to become a slave. Either the slave is trapped, or the slave is bonded, or the slave is in some way coerced. So I think that's a very critical difference. And trafficking relationships may present as one of, I think, my colleagues just mentioned, I think it was Julia, situations in which someone is supposedly repaying a debt. Now, of course, in the slavery context, you don't have a concept of repaying a debt, but in a trafficking situation, you may be being exploited for years, and the notion is that you're paying off this debt which you incurred by being transported, or you incurred by not paying for a fee to work in a particular establishment, or whatever it is. So I think that they are different situations, and I think that the remedies also are different. Slavery really does require rescue, and it does, generally speaking, require someone to be returned from the place to which they live. There's no reason why somebody who has been freed from slavery should be moved somewhere else. But as I mentioned at the beginning, trafficking is different, because trafficking is embedded in a whole environment where abuse of authority and fraud may be the order of the day, and so it's very dangerous often to return people to places from which they were initially trafficked, and people may well not want to be returned, but may prefer to just be protected in their new environment. I don't know if my colleagues would like to add anything. Julie, would you like to say something?
Sure. I would just add that I agree, and I also want to emphasize, I think the use of precise language is very important in this field, because I think what I have found is the use of the very loose use, for example, of the word trafficking can actually cause harm. We work with law enforcement partners who say, well, if we send a client or we refer a client working with a client, they may not trust our referral because other people may have use this term trafficking or slavery in a very loose way. So the only point I would add is just the need for us to really understand these terms as we move forward in a dialogue about this issue.
Great, thank you. Okay, we'll take the next question from Carolyn, which I'll read out. I enjoyed Ms. Cafferty's presentation, but I'd like to point out that there are often men and boys that are victims of sex trafficking in nations all over the world. According to a John Jay Center for Court Innovation's 2008 study in New York City, more than half of the CSEC-identified youth were boys. Also, do you believe that victims of labor trafficking experience similar obstacles when accessing medical care? Liz?
Of course. So men and boys are obviously victims of all types of trafficking. Our research study did just focus on women and girls. That's correct. That was what we decided in terms of what our study group was going to be a few years ago. I'm not familiar with that specific study, and that I'm not sure if that's trafficking or sexual exploitation more broadly. UN numbers tend to quote about 70%, sometimes up to 80% of sex trafficking victims are girls and women, actually. but I'm not familiar with the specific study you're mentioning. And absolutely, I mean, all victims of trafficking, whether it's sex trafficking, whether it's labor trafficking, whether it's domestic servitude, and I think that Julie in particular was pointing out that often it's and it can be very hard, and this was another, challenge in the study. We had lots of people say to us, well, it's hard for me to talk just about sex trafficking because I deal with victims who maybe are domestic servants and also are being sexually abused. It's sometimes hard to pull those apart. So obviously all of these individuals have great health care needs and also have challenges when they try to access health care. I would definitely agree.
And I would just add that, we do work with male labor and sex trafficking victims, and I do find that sometimes the obstacles may be greater because we use existing structures like domestic violence shelters, other social service providers that may be somewhat gender specific, and it does become more difficult to access those services when we're talking about male survivors.
So I think the point here is the point that we made earlier, really, which is that specificity is very important here too, and that there are very different situations, and these terms do cover many different contexts. So for sure, trafficking affects boys and men too, but it seems pretty clear that the majority of people who are survivors of trafficking are women and children and girls. Okay, I'm going to take a question from Ubong. What is your stance position concerning criminalizing prostitution in order to reduce the rate of sex trafficking? This is a question which I think there may well be different opinions amongst us. So maybe I'll just start off for what it's worth to say that my position is I'm against criminalizing the prostitution. I think it does nothing to protect people who are survivors of trafficking, and in fact I think it does nothing to protect sex workers who may need access to health care, they may need access to criminal protection against clients who turn violent and so on. So I think that criminalizing prostitution or sex work does not really address the key problems here. I think it simply extends the law enforcement framework and criminalizes people who actually are in need of assistance and protection and rights. And so personally, I don't think it would reduce the rate of sex trafficking. I think the way to reduce the rate of sex trafficking is to increase the rights of people who are survivors or who are potential victims. And I think you do that not by criminalizing them, but by giving them access to better alternatives. But I don't know if my colleagues agree. So Julie, would you like to say something?
I will say that I agree generally with the point, and what I would say is from my experience, what I've seen in addition to what Jackie says is that, the immigration system is very complex, and there are very significant consequences to criminal conduct. And so we add this by criminalizing prostitution, we add this entire piece to the puzzle of basically increasing consequences for these survivors, re-traumatizing them, and having them go through the additional hoops. And so, yes, I agree with you on that point.
Okay, moving on to a question from John. How would you suggest religious organizations assist in the endeavor to inject human rights into anti-trafficking strategies? Have either of you had experience of this? Would you like to start?
I think that what we found in different places that had more robust responses is that definitely local religious organizations, and that's not necessarily a church, but an organization that has an affiliation with one type of organized religion or the other, could help in coordinating services and providing support for victims, and that it wasn't done in necessarily an evangelical way, but in a way that tried to help provide a sort of victim-centered approach to support for survivors. So I think we have seen some good practice. Probably that would be my point, that helping keep the focus on what is the best for that victim's rehabilitation, and that sometimes that can be sort of very effective. They can be effective advocates in the rehabilitation process.
Julie, would you like to say something?
We're talking about the demand elimination in terms of the human rights framework, yes?
How would you suggest religious organizations assist in the endeavor to inject human
so,
rights?
So yes, I can definitely. The organization I work for is a nonprofit with an affiliation, although we serve anyone. And we've done quite a lot of awareness work that's geared towards the religious community of all types in terms of talking about this issue. And I think it is very, very important because, you know, we can do targeted awareness at our own community, but the reality is in terms of identifying these individuals, most of them, you know, are going to, the identification may happen, you know, from a community member who sees something going on a little bit strange in a house down the corner, you know, a person who's working for a family not really leaving the house. And we reach those individuals through the faith-based community, through other presentations, but I think it's an enormous asset for us in terms of advocates.
So I just to make a brief comment, I would agree with what both Liz and Julie said. I think that in many situations, faith-based organizations can play a role. They can play a role in providing services, in supporting people who need support within the community, in providing alternative strategies and alternative approaches to thinking about the future. I think that there, of course, could be situations in which religious organizations perhaps play a less constructive role if, for example, there is a sort of a moralizing critique of the sort of ethical failings of people who are involved in sex work. I personally wouldn't agree with that approach. I think, you know, one of the problems with prostitution and sex work and its relationship to trafficking is that the people who are engaged in these forms of employment often are kind of seen as being lacking in human dignity and being degraded. And I think that if I'm not suggesting that religious organizations would necessarily do this, but I think there may be some strains of religious belief which are very critical of any form of paid sex. And whatever position you may take on that personally, I think that promoting a view that people who do this work are degraded and despicable is probably not constructive. But having said that, I would say that most of the work that I've seen done by religious organizations in this field has been to support human rights, has been to strengthen the position of people who've been trafficked, and has been to criticize attempts to blame the victims. So in general, I think that religious organizations have played a very positive role. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next question from Karen. How would the issue of demand elimination related to the bias of sex fit within the human rights framework? Julie, would you like to start answering that question?
Sure. I mean, what I would say is I think it's a natural fit. Obviously, if we are looking at this issue as a human rights issue, it makes sense to have an approach that focuses on demand, on basically the constant presence of supply and this idea that we need to fill that basically demand. So what I would say is it's very important, but I do think that these prevention and demand have to work together. So we have to have the investigation, prosecution, and the legal framework that underlies that work effectively, and we have to also focus on demand. I think one of the issues in the United States has been there's not really enough funding federally to do all of that and do it well, and the issues with the legal framework being somewhat flawed. So I think I definitely agree, and I think we need to devote more resources to the issue of demand, because without that, you know, there will be a constant supply of women, and this will continue to happen.
I think I probably would just add that this would fit in terms of public health approaches as well. Public health loves doing sort of campaigns on issues, and I think I would point to in South Africa, there is a lot of work doing a public awareness campaign targeted at men to decrease violence against women. And Canada, and I wish I could remember there, I was just reading over the weekend that the city in Canada is doing one right now in terms of rape and encouraging men not, it's something like don't be that guy. And so, things like that are targeted at men to raise awareness of that sort of role that they obviously play that Julie just mentioned in this issue. And I think that also challenges the sort of dynamic that Jackie laid out for us in the beginning in terms of, the poor victim and the sort of evil trafficker perpetrator. Well, there's also another group in that, and that's the men who are fueling the demand.
So I agree with part of the sort of spirit behind the question, but perhaps not all of it. I think that it depends what demand you're talking about. So I think the demand for people who are exploitable absolutely needs to be targeted. I think that the demand for, abusive, violent types of sexual or physical labor needs to be targeted. I think eliminating the demand for sex is a different matter, and I don't necessarily think that, that goes back to the conversation about criminalizing prostitution. I'm not sure that that is the way to deal with this. So I think there's a distinction between, say, if we're talking about sex, I think there's a distinction between sex work, what you might say simpliciter, and sex work which is violent or abusive, where the client is being violent and behaving in a way which is criminally prosecutable. Just like in any other situations, you can't beat people and torture people. So it applies in this situation too. So I think that eliminating the demand for abusive and exploitative work, absolutely. Eliminating the demand for sex work, period, I would say is a different matter. So that's how I would qualify my answer. So because I think it's easy then to slip into the situation of saying where you end up saying, well, we should basically be banning all forms of sex work, and then you are really on a slippery slope to criminalizing prostitution. So I think that is a danger. I'm going to take the next question in a minute. Before I do that, I just want to encourage our audience and our listeners to please send in your questions. We have a little time more, and so we might be able to get to your question if you send it in quickly. But in the meantime, let me move. Sorry, we had a question about the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. Which I'm just trying to find. Yeah, sorry. So this is a question from Colleen, and she says, thank you for your presentation. I have a question for the panel. Do you think the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and its reauthorizations adequately incorporates the human rights-based approach? So, Judy, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I think that it begins that incorporation. I think what happened, because the TVPA is really the result of compromise, it incorporates more of a prosecution-based approach in some ways. For example, with this T visa, the individual does have to comply with a reasonable request for assistance in general, with limited exceptions, in order to be eligible for relief. And while that does help in terms of the prosecution and investigation of these crimes, it creates some real obstacles and really isn't a victim-centered approach. So I think that there are ways that we can build upon the work that's been done and really kind of shift the dialogue from prosecution to really a human rights-based approach, and that is still happening.
No, I very much agree with that, and I think that one of the most concrete suggestions, which I think both Julie and I made, is that access to T visas has to be made easier, and so the onus is not just on the countries abroad to prevent trafficking from the source countries, if you like, insofar as they are source countries, but also to make protection much more easily accessible, so to reduce the burden on the applicant to demonstrate coercion in the way that's currently required, which eliminates access to protection for so many people. I think it is really deplorable that you have 5,000 T visas in theory available every year, and you actually only give protection to less than 300 people. That's really an indictment of the system. So I think that a lot more could be done, and I think that given that the T visa system the principle is a good one, it would be an opportunity really for very good practice on the part of the U.S. government to make this a more, if you like, aggressive policy. And I think it's interesting to look at the analogy with the U visas, which some of you may have heard of. U visas are visas which are available to people who have been victims of serious crime. And the U visa ceiling, until I think not so long ago, was also very underutilized. But in recent years, the full quota of U visas has actually been taken up. And I think that's a great model for our area, that I think it should be, as I was suggesting, it should be an index of good performance, of good kind of employment record for people responsible for issuing G visas to issue them. So, you know, that I think would be a way of really injecting a more rights-based approach into the current framework. Sorry, Julie, go ahead.
No, sorry, I was just going to add, I mean, I do think we have a framework for even building a standard in terms of looking at refugee or asylum law, where we have recognized that in that area, for example, it is difficult to prove that you fear persecution, et cetera. But we've created a whole body of law that provides standards for that and provides that a case could be granted, you know, based on limited evidence. And yet in the T visa context, where we have a similar situation where an individual may not have a lot of proof, there are quite a plethora of additional loops that they have to kind of hoops that they have to jump through in terms of, you know, this cooperation and showing hardship. You know, there are more things that they have to do, and in some ways that isn't a logical jump. So I think we do have analogies that we can rely on in trying to build a more human rights-based approach here.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question which is actually similar to a question we already answered, so we probably won't spend too long on it, but let me just read it anyway. It's from Jody. One of the most striking descriptions of DMST, which I take it stands for domestic minor sex trafficking victimization, included a teen being repeatedly approached by a variety of traffickers in different guises over a number of years. The youth rejected many approaches from ages 12 to 15 from friends, parents, the woman at the mall, the older guy, and finally succumbed and was trafficked from 15 to 17. My point is, we are all still reactive rather than understanding the importance of comprehensive prevention. Domestic minor sex trafficking unfortunately falls by the wayside in terms of funding because it involves runaway and throwaway children. How do we address prevention now? So I think, Jody, as we said in answer to a previous question, you're absolutely right to identify minors and minors who are trafficked within the U.S. as being an area of concern. And as I think we already indicated, we know this happens on a very large scale. And I think the point you make about these children being sort of children who are not seen as being worthy recipients of a lot of resources and a lot of assistance is actually also a very good point, which I've also thought about quite a bit. Very often the kids who need the most protection and who are most vulnerable and often most exploited are also those who are somehow seen as being borderline juvenile delinquent or in some way homeless and disreputable. And so instead of being more targeted for assistance and support and rights, they are somehow targeted for punishment and abuse and forms of sort of correction, which just drive them to run away and get into further danger. So I very much agree with your point. As to how we address prevention now, I would say, before I invite my colleagues to jump in, I would say that, you know, really here we are basically talking very much about root causes of problems, and though you want each individual case to be dealt with and to have, you know, a human rights injection, if you like, applied, in many of these cases, we are talking about lack of opportunity, we're talking about poverty, we're talking about complicated home situations where you need family strengthening policies, you need better education systems. You know, usually when you get to the stage of somebody who has rejected approaches for 3 years or more, as you say, finally succumbing, it's because you have a home environment or a kind of base environment which is really lacking in protection. So probably there are no simple answers, but it does mean that if people are serious about tackling these problems, they really do need to support politicians who want to allocate resources to these areas of work, and unfortunately that's not really what we're seeing right now. But I don't know if, Julie, would you like to say something, or Liz?
I don't have anything to add.
I can just make a few comments. I would agree with everything Jackie just said, and actually when we were looking at, you know, what were the social economic determinants of sex trafficking, all the certain things Jackie touched on, you know, who's at risk for this in terms of what girls? Well, there are girls who grow up in what we would say are unstable families, who are probably physically and or sexually abused when they're young, usually by family members or someone well known to them, who are in and out of school, maybe living with relatives, back and forth between grandparents and the single parent, and they don't have lots of stability in their lives. They may be poor in relation to others in their social circle or town, and hence they have this huge vulnerability to people who are approaching them in the way that sort of the questioner, the inquirer mentioned. And so in terms of what we were, you know, what can healthcare do in these situations? Well, screening for the sort of children who are at risk and who would be doing that screening. And one group that we sort of identified, particularly in the U.S. and the U.K., and some of them are already involved in this, are school nurses who often see this group of children that Jackie and I have been describing. And so particularly when they're quite young, this may be the only sort of health care that they're receiving. And these children often do end up in the school nurse's office because it's someplace where they feel they're safe, they can sort of have a time out, they can get attention in a very positive sense. And so we've been definitely talking to lots of these groups in terms of trying to raise their own awareness.
Okay. Let me see. Let's move on to the next question. So we have a question from Dottie. Have you seen non-exploitative forms of sex work? Please explain. So that's a great question, I think. Let me start by saying that, you know, the way you view sex work depends on your framework. So just to summarize, there really is a split, even within people who consider themselves human rights advocates or who consider themselves women rights advocates. There's a split, I would say, just to simplify, between two radically different positions. One position you could characterize as being the abolitionist position. People who think, and maybe you would agree with this position, Dottie, I'm not sure, people who think that any type of sex work is essentially, quintessentially degrading, and that no woman would do sex work unless she had to. So by definition, if somebody is a sex worker, they are being coerced, maybe not directly but indirectly, and that therefore all sex work is exploitative. And therefore some people who have this position think that criminalization is actually a good idea. Some people who have this position think that prevention is a good idea, and so on. And people who think of sex work as being quintessentially exploitative and degrading of women tend to be of the view that that abolishing sex work as much as possible is a critical necessity. So for them, there really isn't much difference between trafficking and sex work more generally, just that trafficking is even worse, because any sex work is exploitative. That's one group, what I could call the abolitionist group. The other group has a radically different position. They view sex work as a form of employment, like working in a mine or working in a brick factory or being in a salt mine or working in, in a as a cleaner or whatever, many other types of menial work. And according to that perspective, what you want to do is to make sure that sex workers, like other workers, have access to full labor rights, that they have access to protection from violence, that they have access to protection from harassment, that they have access to protection from illness, so that they have regular free health checks, that they have rights respecting dignified working environment, and so on. So that perspective really, instead of being an abolitionist perspective, is more, I would say, a perspective that looks at the sort of labor contract and says there may be people who don't have great alternatives, and they would rather do this work than other types of work, that they would, because it may, in many cases, be better paid than the other types of work they have available. And really what you want to do is to remove the stigma, remove the degrading nature of sex work, and strengthen the bargaining power of the women, typically the women who do this work, and make it possible for them to free themselves from the threats and the violence. And so in that sense, there could be forms of sex work which are non-exploitative. And of course, some people in this camp, if you like, would go as far as to say that some types of sex workers are nearly like therapists. They're doing a service, and they should be paid for it. That, sex work has been around for as long as we know, and we might like to think that it could be gotten rid of, but it's not. So it's very important to make sure that the people who are doing this job are not despised. So those are the two camps, and so I think that if you're in the first camp, so to speak, probably your answer would be no, that you could not see a non-exploitative form of sex work because by definition sex work is exploitative. If you're in the second camp, you would probably be able to say, yes, I have seen non-exploitative forms of sex work, and you might point, for example, to this big area in Calcutta, a famous area in the red light district, Sonaguchi it's called, where there's been this collective of sex workers now for well over 10 years, maybe 20 years, who are really organized, who have regular health checkups. They have a system where if a client turns violent, he's thrown out, where they have good relationships with the police, where they turn away anyone who's under the age of 18 and say, this work is only available to women over 18 and so on. And they are organized more like a trade union. So I think that's the best way I can answer your question. But I don't know if my colleagues have anything to add. Julie, would you like to say something?
I would say that, I think I would call myself, in theory, more in the latter camp. Although what I think what is difficult is as you see these cases, I think more of the cases that I tend to see do involve exploitation, and as you get into the nitty-gritty, it is more difficult to find cases that do involve, real, authentic choice. Not that it isn't out there, but I think it is difficult. And I think even, Nicholas Kristof just wrote a book about that. It touched on the issue of trafficking and talked about that center in Calcutta. And when he went to visit, he argued that when you look deeper, there were still issues of coercion present. Not to say that was ever present. So I do think in theory there is a choice to be made, but I think often in practice it's hard to distill out that choice when we're facing these other issues of poverty and abuse of women and all of those. So it is complicated.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, Julian. I'm glad you drew attention to Nicholas Kristof's book. So I think we've had a great discussion, and we're just nearly out of time. So I'm going to thank all of you very much for participating and sending us interesting questions. We hope we've answered them and stimulated your thinking. And I'd like to thank my two colleagues for their really nice presentations, Elizabeth Cafferty and Julie Dahlstrom. And look forward to participating in one of these with you in the future. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.